Hello, this is Tony Brasunas on Red, White, and Blind, where we unpack the corporate news narratives to get to the story behind the story. Today we're talking about the origin of the coronavirus and why it was that for 3 years we were unable to question in the corporate mainstream media the wet market theory of where this virus came from. If you like this kind of content, you should know that these types of investigations are often suppressed by the algorithms in social media, so please like and share this if you find this type of investigation interesting. Without further ado, let's roll the intro and get into the origin of the coronavirus. Picture the scene. Late in 2019 in the city of Shanghai, China. Shi Zhengli hailed a taxicab on a crowded Shanghai street. She climbed inside and urged the cab driver to hurry. Traffic was thick, but she needed to get to the train station. She absolutely had to catch the next train to Wuhan. A virologist and expert on bat coronaviruses, Shi had been attending a conference in the Pearl City when her phone rang with a call that would change her life. "Drop whatever you're doing and get back to the lab," ordered her supervisor, the director of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. "You need to be here. You need to deal with this." It was the evening of December 30th, 2019. Two mysterious viral samples had arrived at the Wuhan Lab earlier that day from a nearby hospital. Doctors at the hospital reported seeing patients with an unusual type of pneumonia, and the doctors requested the assistance of the lab, which was nearby and, fortuitously, was China's most sophisticated virology center. As for Shi, she was no small fish in the pond of Chinese virology. Director of the Institute's Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases, she had led cutting-edge research in her lab for years. She focused on viruses and engaged in quote-unquote gain-of-function experiments, efforts to engineer viruses to be more transmissible, more deadly, or both. The ostensible reason to do this dangerous research was to predict possible evolutionary paths of viruses in the wild and to be prepared should a deadly strain emerge. Now, a great deal of this type of research has historically been done to create biological weapons for use in unconventional warfare. So the true purpose of the research was not clear, and remains unclear, to outside observers. In particular, Shi had been working for years on isolating coronaviruses from bats. She traveled to caves in distant Yunnan province and performed gain-of-function experiments on the viruses she found, combining them and genetically modifying them via cutting-edge viral manipulation technology. The work was intense and controversial. It was also prestigious and partially funded by the United States. Shi jumped out of the cab and slipped into the train station just in time. She stepped aboard the train to Wuhan, accelerating away from the Shanghai station and winding its way west through the city's suburbs. The express train darted out of the city. Before long, Shi was gazing out the window at the slopes of the Dabie Mountains of Anhui province. When she had signal, she called her subordinates at the lab and discussed methods to discern whether the pathogen, which appeared to be a new virus, could in fact have escaped from her lab. The week that followed was the most stressful time of her life, Shi later told the magazine Scientific American. The new virus was clearly infecting people in Wuhan. She spent hours examining its genetic characteristics to determine whether it was an organism she had created. She was horrified. She was anxious. She didn't sleep for days. According to the Chinese media, test results showed that there was no match between the viral samples provided by the hospital and the viruses that Shi had harvested from the bats in distant Yunnan province. What was unclear, however, was whether the hospital samples matched any of the viruses that Schur's team had created through its gain-of-function experiments. What was even less clear was whether the Chinese media would tell the truth either way. An English zoologist named Peter Dazak was also tirelessly working half a world away. He had overseen the American funding of Schur's controversial work in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. For years, Dazak had done this, and he stood to lose significant money and reputation, his entire career perhaps, were it discovered that the virus had actually been created by experiments that his organization, named the EcoHealth Alliance, had been funding via grants from the United States NIH. Dazak reached out frantically to friends and labs around the world. He pulled together a team that could declare that the virus couldn't have escaped from Schur's laboratory and must have emerged naturally in a food market in a nearby district of the city. Published with much fanfare in the United States and Britain, Dazak's team's paper in the prestigious Lancet journal asserted that there was no evidence for anything other than the, quote, natural zoonotic, unquote, theory, whereby the virus had jumped organically from bats to an intermediary species, such as a pangolin, and then from that pangolin to humans. We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories, suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin, they wrote, dropping that odd media slur, conspiracy theory, right into a scientific paper just like that. We declare no competing interests, the paper added. What was not disclosed in the paper, nor in corporate media coverage, was how closely Dazak had worked with the Wuhan Lab, and how many competing financial interests he in fact did have in the paper's verdict. Neither the paper nor the corporate media at the time mentioned that two signatories on the paper worked directly for him, in fact, or that he had pushed many of the other signatories into signing. Dazak had even covertly edited parts of the paper to conceal his own role in its writing. All of that information slowly slipped out in smaller publications and independent media. But the mainstream corporate media channels never revealed Dazak's role at the Wuhan Lab. Why might that be? What might explain this oversight? Let's examine the biases that led to this censorship. To begin with, the central argument made in Dazak's team's paper was actually fairly weak. Alongside bemoaning quote-unquote conspiracy theories, the paper asserted that the mutations present in the virus were just too unusual for human ingenuity to have invented. Far from proof, this wasn't even rigorous logic given the current state of virus manipulation technology. Nevertheless, the paper and a resulting article in Nature magazine were enough for corporate media trendsetters like NPR and the New York Times. The entire mainstream left-leaning media thereafter, indeed, throughout the year 2020, reported on the virus as if it were absolutely certainly of natural origin, competing ideas were quote-unquote debunked conspiracy theories, and even the need for any further inquiry was dismissed as paranoid. President Trump, on the other hand, and then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, then Senator Tom Cotton, and then noted evolutionary biologists Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, and many, many other experts, began to suggest that the virus might have had a lab origin. This is still middle of 2020. But the New York Times called this a, quote, fringe conspiracy theory, unquote, in a sarcastic article entitled, "Pompeo Ties Coronavirus to Chinese Lab Despite Spy Agency's Uncertainty." The piece didn't leave the question open, catalog divergent opinions, or provide actual evidence one way or the other. Instead, it repeatedly implied one side was right and the other side was wrong. The piece quoted unnamed sources and unnamed American allies, and that was that. That one article was enough. It set the tone, as the New York Times often does, for the entire American blue news corporate media landscape. For the rest of 2020, the media's unscientific rush to judgment kneecapped scientific inquiry into the virus. The NIH even gave EcoHealth Alliance more money later that year to fund more risky virus experimentation. The idea that the virus might have come from Shi Zhongli's lab, the quote-unquote lab leak hypothesis, as it was called, was neither debunked nor a conspiracy, but it was a theory. It was quite a plausible theory. By 2020, Scher's team at the Wuhan Lab had harvested more bat coronaviruses than any other lab in the world, and the pandemic had broken out in the exact city where the lab was located. But suggesting a laboratory origin elicited attacks and censorship on social and independent media, which chilled debate on this critical question. This is what we're interested in today. Influential independent talk show host Joe Rogan, for instance, outlined the evidence for a lab origin in September of 2020. He was denounced as a quote-unquote conspiracy theorist. Fernando Castro Chavez, a molecular biologist with hundreds of scholarly citations, wrote a widely distributed article that analyzed the gene sequence of SARS-CoV-2, revealing telltale furin cleavage sites that suggested human manipulation and a lab origin. His interviews were taken down by YouTube. Independent health program The Highwire presented doctors discussing the likelihood of a lab origin. Its videos were also taken down by YouTube, and its press release privileges were revoked by PR Newswire. Financial and cultural blog Zero Hedge asked the same questions. It was labeled a, quote, far-right website, unquote, that, quote-unquote, amplifies conspiracy theories, and was removed by Twitter and delisted by Google. Even a Chinese virologist claiming he had proof that the virus was created in the lab was banned from Twitter. As plausible as it was, the theory was verboten in corporate media and on the main social media networks. It became a hot potato no one wanted to touch. Everyone who was anyone had to swear that the virus had evolved naturally, leaping from animals to other animals and then to humans in a market, ideally using the fancy word zoonosis. This term told the beginning, middle, and end of the story. It was a narrative not to be questioned. That was 2020, the year the virus shut down the world. No one was allowed to question where the virus had come from. Early in 2021, things began to shift, just a little bit. The CDC director himself resigned and provided his honest opinion once he could speak freely. The virus had been created in a lab, he said. This emboldened a few corporate media outlets to publish modestly open-minded analyses, including a pivotal piece that summarized the evidence in favor of the lab, the quote, lab leak hypothesis, unquote, including the telltale furin cleavage sites in the virus's genetic code. Similarities to other manipulated viruses continued to emerge. Meanwhile, no direct evidence ever emerged for the media's favorite narrative, the natural zoonosis theory. This theory required three things. First, an intermediary animal host to enable viral transmission from bats to humans. Second, evidence of early antigen activity in the market workers. And three, a plausible trail of natural evolution in the virus's genetics. None of this ever emerged, not in 2020, not in 2021, and not in 2022. Only indirect and inconclusive evidence supported the zoonosis theory, such as data analysis on the locations of the first known cases, but even that evidence didn't directly contradict the lab leak theory. Further unsettling for wet market zoonosis supporters were revelations that the Wuhan Lab's experimentation on bat coronaviruses was not rigorously secured. Scher's lab carried out its work at Biosafety Level 2, BSL-2, when such work is generally performed at BSL-3 or higher by international virologists. Richard Ebright, a Rutgers University microbiologist, likened the conditions in the Wuhan lab to the biosafety level of a US dentist's office. So now the world knew. The US NIH had funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab. That research was on precisely the types of bat coronaviruses that form the backbone of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. The new virus bore striking similarities to other lab-created viruses. And finally, that work had been carried out in an insecure fashion. Nevertheless, the notion that the virus had been created in the lab remained off-limits in most corporate media. Brief mentions of the CDC director's opinion, the lax safety standards, or the furin cleavage sites would surface, but disappear quickly. This media deception prevented free inquiry into one of the world's most pressing questions. This is what I call narrative management in my new book, Red, White, and Blind. The corporate media repeated one narrative over and over, making it dominant, while minimizing or concealing facts contradicting it. Puncturing the narrative, molecular biologist Alina Chan of MIT collaborated with Matt Ridley, best-selling author of Genome, to publish a 2022 book entitled Viral, which carefully examined the virus's origin. In an interview on independent media, Chan pointed out the insanely unlikely coincidences that confronted her when investigating the story. She said that the discovery of the NIH's gain-of-function grants to the Wuhan Lab in 2018 was like uncovering a 2018 proposal for putting horns on horses, and then in 2019 seeing unicorns in Wuhan. Peter Dazak was the man who perhaps most vehemently rejected a lab origin of the virus. He was the funder of the Wuhan Lab work through EcoHealth Alliance, the guy who had pulled together the original conspiracy theory article in Lancet. But a colleague of his was just as adamant. NIAID Director Anthony Fauci, our vaunted face of the American response to COVID, testified repeatedly to Congress in both 2020 and early in 2021 that the zoonosis theory was an absolute certainty. Again and again he said it. There was zero question about it in his mind. The very suggestion of a lab origin was, quote, preposterous, unquote, he declared. The most ridiculous, majestic leap I've ever heard of. Fauci also refused to acknowledge publicly that his organization had funded Dazak's EcoHealth Alliance and Schur's risky gain-of-function research. Going further, in an interview with MSNBC, Fauci declared not only that the virus was certainly of natural origin, but that those who disagreed with him on the matter disagreed not with him, but with science itself. It was a claim of infallibility. He responded the way a dictator or a pope might to criticism. Much of his credibility would turn on this remark, which he repeated many times. The month of August 2021 wreaked havoc on the credibility of both the New York Times and Dr. Fauci. Evidence emerged that the newspaper had accepted millions of dollars in payments from the Chinese government to run coverage approved by the Chinese on topics concerning China. Additional published evidence proved that the NIH had in fact funded the research and that Fauci and other officials had coordinated with media organizations to discredit scientists supporting the lab leak theory. As public opinion shifted toward the lab leak theory, cracks appeared in many experts' statements. Fauci, for one, changed his tune entirely when speaking to CNN. He inexplicably claimed he had, quote, always kept an open mind, unquote, about a lab origin. CNN didn't choose to point out that he had called the theory preposterous and ridiculous less than a year earlier. President Joe Biden, who had never publicly questioned the zoonosis theory, responded to public outcry and requested a full review of the question by the intelligence agencies. The agencies came back 3 months later without a conclusive finding, but each agency concluded that the lab leak theory was plausible. The Lancet itself, the prestigious medical journal that had published Dazak's team's original paper, quote, strongly condemning conspiracy theories, unquote, changed its course in 2022 as well and called the lab origin possible. Yet the idea was still treated in the corporate media as, quote, dangerous misinformation, unquote. Even after countless doctors, innumerable scientists, and fully 72% of the American public indicated belief that the virus had originated in a lab, the corporate media ridiculed the idea if it mentioned it at all. Why would this be? The scientific community was not certain about the virus's origin, but the New York Times, CNN, NPR, and MSNBC all silenced and censored one side of a scientific debate. Why? As I uncover in my new book, Red, White, and Blind, and as we will explore in this show, the reach of the corporations that make drugs, you know, what we call Big Pharma, fund and sponsor much of our corporate media, and their reach is far, deep, and undeniable. They saw trillions in profits coming their way from their otherwise unproven mRNA vaccines. Would knowledge of the virus's genome indicate what we eventually learned about the mRNA injection's shortcomings? Or were even larger and darker forces at play that sought to conceal the inner workings of the Wuhan Lab? It is essential to understand how and why news narratives are managed. Censoring mere questions about the origin of SARS-CoV-2 impaired scientific study of the virus at a time when open inquiry might have saved thousands of lives. The New York Times is still distorting this story today. A 2022 piece entitled "New Research Points to Wuhan Market as Pandemic Origin" purported to present conclusive evidence to support its long-held side. But in fact, the analysis ran over the same ground. What was new were some fancy graphics depicting an analysis of known data. It was interesting, but in no way did the piece provide what the headline promised: proof about the provenance of this virus. But of course, most people don't read much beyond the headlines of long technical stories. So the headlines served as the narrative management. The vaunted New York Times has in fact still never run a neutral story on the topic, let alone a story acknowledging the vast preponderance of evidence favoring a lab origin. Why? This censorship harms humanity to this very day. When emails from Fauci and the authors of the original Lancet and Nature articles were released last month, The Nation, a mildly anti-establishment magazine, printed a piece with some of the unredacted emails from Fauci, showing how the question of the virus's origin was suppressed deliberately by government officials, abetted by editors at the nation's most prestigious publications. This is what I call nefarious bias. It is distinct from other more benign types of bias that I identify in my book, Red, White, and Blind. Only pervasive, coordinated, nefarious manipulation could have prevented this story from getting a fair shake in the corporate news for 3 years. It wasn't one biased editor at one news organization or one compromised science institution. This kind of censorship isn't a Democrat or a Republican thing either. It goes far deeper than that, and I hope you see this. Widespread distortion and censorship infect our corporate news media. This is why we are, as I say in my new book, Red, White, and Blind. We are all in a state of deception. Ultimately, the disastrous suppression of inquiry into the true origin of the virus was a result of concerted media censorship, and it prevented the public from learning about COVID when it would have most deeply and truly mattered. We might never know for absolute certain where the virus originated, just as we don't know for absolute certain whether Iraq had weapons of mass destruction prior to the catastrophic and deadly 2003 invasion. At this point, however, the evidence heavily favors the theory that the virus came out of Shi Zhongli's lab in Wuhan. She didn't sleep for days because she knew it was likely. The next question really is, did it accidentally leak, or was it deliberately released? Don't expect the corporate media to present that question fairly. Of course, the story wasn't censored by all media. Independent media continued to cover the story. The internet's groundbreaking power to connect people without an intermediary authority is the reason I'm optimistic about where we are headed with our media in this country. We are entering a phase that I am calling the New Enlightenment, when independent media slowly but surely takes over from the top-down, one-way street of the corporate media news. We are now able to inform each other. You're able to make a video, I'm able to make a video, we're able to do our own investigations and share it, and as we find the truth together, we will continue down this road that I am calling the New Enlightenment. And that's it for this episode of Red, White, and Blind. No one was able to know the true origin of a virus that killed millions and shut down the world because of thick media bias. That bias and censorship goes far beyond the red news and blue news bias that we see every day in corporate media. Call me crazy if you're lazy, that's how I see it. I'm Tony Brasunas. This has been Red, White, and Blind. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much.